They tell us history is the story of kings, wars, and empires. But what if the real story was written on women's bodies, in laws that controlled their breath, rules that decided when they could speak, and punishments for dreams they were never allowed to have? Tonight, we begin a journey into a past so restrictive, so unsettling, that many of its rules sound more like nightmares than laws. Imagine being born guilty, not because of something you did, but because of who you were. In much of the ancient world, being born a woman meant entering a cage you could not see, but would feel for the rest of your life. A cage made of traditions, religious laws, and social expectations so powerful that even love could not break them. And the most shocking part? These rules were not written by villains. They were written by societies that believed they were being moral. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradles of civilization, women lived under laws carved into stone, literally. The Code of Hammurabi, written nearly 4,000 years ago, set strict rules for women's behavior. If a woman was accused of adultery, even without proof, she could be thrown into a river to let the gods decide her fate. If she drowned, she was guilty. If she survived, she was innocent. Men, however, were rarely subjected to the same tests. A wife was considered the property of her husband. Her body, her fertility, even her silence belonged to him. A man could divorce his wife for infertility, but a woman could not leave a cruel husband without severe consequences. Freedom was not a right, it was a privilege reserved for men. Ancient Egypt surprises historians. Compared to other ancient societies, Egyptian women had more legal rights. They could own property, run businesses, and even file for divorce. But don't be fooled. Socially, women were still confined by expectations. A woman's worth was tied almost entirely to her role as a wife and mother. Public power was rare, and leadership positions were almost exclusively male, except for rare figures like Cleopatra or Hatshepsut, who ruled only by breaking every social norm. For the average Egyptian woman, stepping outside prescribed roles invited suspicion and punishment. Independence was tolerated, but only up to a point. Now we enter ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy. But democracy had a catch. It was only for men. In Athens, women were legally classified alongside children and slaves. They could not vote, own property independently, or participate in public debates. An ideal woman was expected to stay indoors, speak softly, and remain invisible. A popular Greek saying claimed that the best woman was the one least spoken of, whether for good or bad. Girls were married as young as 13 or 14, often to men twice their age. Their purpose was clear: produce legitimate heirs. Education? Rare. Choice? Almost non-existent. Sparta was different, but not free. Spartan women were trained physically, encouraged to be strong, and even allowed to own land. This often confuses modern readers. But this strength served one purpose only: to produce strong male warriors. A Spartan woman's body was valued not for her autonomy, but for her reproductive potential. If she failed to produce sons, she faced shame and social exclusion. Her strength was not hers, it belonged to the state. In ancient Rome, women lived under patria potestas, the absolute authority of a male head of household. A woman could be legally controlled by her father, then transferred to her husband like property. Roman women could not vote or hold office. Even wealthy women, draped in luxury, lived under constant legal supervision. One Roman law limited how much gold a woman could wear. Another restricted her from riding in a carriage during daylight hours. Why? Because female visibility was seen as dangerous. As civilizations grew, religion often reinforced restrictions. In many ancient cultures, menstruation was seen as impure. Women were isolated, banned from religious spaces, or forced into ritual cleansing. Pregnancy, childbirth, and female sexuality were surrounded by fear and superstition. Women were blamed for natural events they could not control. The female body became a battleground between morality and fear. History rarely records women's voices. We don't know how many cried in silence, how many dreams were buried, how many brilliant minds were never allowed to speak. What we do know is this: these restrictions were not accidental. They were designed to control inheritance, lineage, and power, and they worked for thousands of years. Even in the darkest systems, resistance existed, in whispered conversations, in forbidden knowledge passed from mother to daughter, in small acts of defiance history barely remembers. Because oppression, no matter how powerful, is never absolute. Fear was not an accident in the ancient world. It was a system. Rules alone were never enough to control women, so societies perfected punishment. Because nothing keeps a population obedient like watching someone else suffer. And for women who dared to step outside their assigned boundaries, punishment was swift, public, and unforgettable. In many ancient societies, the first punishment was not physical, it was social death. In ancient Greece, a woman accused of sexual impropriety could be paraded through her community, her reputation permanently destroyed. Even if the accusation was false, the damage could never be undone. A disgraced woman became untouchable. Neighbors whispered, families turned away, marriage prospects vanished. And without marriage, a woman often had no legal or economic protection. Shame was a life sentence. Across ancient civilizations, adultery laws were brutally unequal. In Mesopotamia, a married woman caught or merely accused of adultery could be drowned, stoned, or executed alongside her alleged partner. A married man, however, could sleep with slaves, concubines, or prostitutes without punishment. The crime was not betrayal, it was ownership violation. A woman's sexuality was seen as a man's property, and any damage to it was treated as theft. Roman society liked to claim it protected women, but protection often meant control. A Roman father had the legal right to kill his daughter if he believed she had brought dishonor to the family. While this extreme was not always enforced, the threat alone kept many women obedient. Women accused of adultery could be exiled, stripped of property, or forced into isolation. And once labeled immoral, a woman lost nearly all legal credibility. Her testimony in court could be dismissed simply because of her reputation. Punishment was not always hidden. In some cultures, it was a spectacle. In ancient Assyria, women convicted of sexual offenses could have their noses or ears cut off, a permanent mark of shame. In others, women were buried alive, stoned publicly, or tied to stakes for execution. These punishments served a purpose beyond justice. They were warnings. A single execution could silence thousands. Sometimes the crime wasn't sex, it was speech. In ancient Athens, women were expected to remain silent in public spaces. A woman who spoke too boldly, challenged male authority, or expressed opinions publicly risked punishment, or at the very least, social destruction. Philosophers openly argued that women lacked the rational capacity for public thought. Silence was not politeness, it was survival. As religion and law merged, punishment gained divine justification. A woman who disobeyed her husband was not just rebellious, she was sinful. In many early religious traditions, women were blamed for humanity's suffering. Stories portrayed women as temptresses, corrupters, or moral weak points. This made punishment feel righteous. A woman punished was not a victim, she was a lesson. Some punishments were quieter, but just as devastating. Women accused of dishonor could be locked away, forced into lifelong isolation, or sent into exile. Without family or community, survival became nearly impossible. Isolation broke spirits faster than chains ever could. Perhaps the most effective punishment was fear of punishment. Women learned to police themselves. They learned when to lower their eyes, when to stay silent, when not to dream. Control became internal, and once that happened, societies no longer needed violence as often. Despite everything, women resisted. Some ran away. Some used deception. Some formed secret networks of support. Others pushed boundaries quietly, educating daughters in secret, passing down forbidden knowledge, or refusing to internalize shame. These acts were small, but they were dangerous, and they mattered. How many women were punished, not for wrongdoing, but for wanting more? More freedom, more voice, more life. History records their punishments, rarely their courage. Long before a girl could speak her first word, her future was already written, not by destiny, not by the gods, but by tradition. In the ancient world, birth was not just a beginning, it was a judgment. And for many families, the moment a daughter was born, disappointment followed. In countless ancient societies, sons meant strength, inheritance, and continuity. Daughters meant expense, risk, and vulnerability. From China to Greece, from Rome to India, the birth of a boy was celebrated. The birth of a girl was often met with silence or fear. A daughter required protection. Protection required control, and control began immediately. One of the darkest truths of the ancient world is something history books often soften: female infanticide. In ancient Greece and Rome, it was socially acceptable for a father to decide whether a newborn would live or die. If the child was weak, disabled, or simply unwanted, often because she was a girl, she could be abandoned, left on a hillside, at a crossroads, or at the edge of a city. Some infants were rescued and raised as slaves. Many were not. This was not considered murder. It was considered practicality. Although more common in later periods, early Chinese traditions reflected a deep fear of female independence. Girls were raised to be obedient, quiet, and physically constrained. Centuries later, foot binding would become one of the most extreme examples of this mindset, breaking young girls' feet to ensure they could not walk freely. The message was clear: a woman's place was not in the world, it was inside the home. In ancient India, religious texts described women as needing constant male guardianship. A girl was protected by her father, a wife by her husband, a widow by her son. A woman alone was considered dangerous to herself and to society. Girls were often married before puberty, their personal desires irrelevant. Marriage was not a union, it was a transfer of ownership. Roman girls were taught domestic skills from early childhood. Reading and writing were allowed, but only enough to manage a household. Education beyond that was discouraged. Why educate someone who would never be allowed to use knowledge freely? Girls were married young, often to strengthen political alliances or financial ties. Love was optional. Obedience was not. Sparta, again, stands apart, but only slightly. Spartan girls trained physically alongside boys, ran races, and developed strength. But this freedom had boundaries. Their purpose remained reproductive. Strong girls would become mothers of strong warriors. Their bodies belonged to the state. Their futures were not their own. Girls learned rules without being told. Don't speak loudly. Don't ask too many questions. Don't attract attention. From a young age, girls learned that safety came from invisibility. A well-behaved girl was praised. A curious girl was corrected. Across ancient societies, educating women was seen as dangerous. An educated woman could question authority. A questioning woman could disrupt order. So knowledge was rationed. In many cultures, women were forbidden from learning sacred texts, legal codes, or philosophy. Ignorance was framed as virtue. As girls approached adolescence, anxiety grew. A girl's body was seen as a liability. Her sexuality, whether expressed or not, was considered dangerous. Families worried about dishonor, gossip, and loss of reputation. Control tightened. Surveillance increased. Freedom vanished. By the time a girl became a woman, nearly every decision had been made for her. Whom she would marry, where she would live, what her purpose would be. Choice was not part of the design. Some girls refused to accept their fate. Some learned in secret. Some delayed marriage. Some challenged expectations in small, quiet ways. History rarely names them, but they existed.
The home was supposed to be a woman's safe place. That was the story repeated across centuries and civilizations. Outside was danger, temptation, chaos. Inside was order, protection, honor. But for countless women in the ancient world, the home was not a refuge. It was a boundary they were never meant to cross. A carefully designed space where control could be exercised quietly, daily, and without witnesses. From the moment a woman entered her husband's household, her world began to shrink. In ancient Rome, marriage often placed a woman under the authority of her husband or his family. Even when Roman women gained limited property rights over time, daily life remained tightly regulated. Her movements, her visitors, even her clothing could be supervised. A respectable woman was not expected to wander freely. Being seen too often in public invited suspicion. Staying inside was not only encouraged, it was demanded. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, the household was sharply divided by gender. The women's quarters were separate, tucked away from public view. A respectable woman spent most of her life within these walls, managing domestic tasks and raising children. Male guests were entertained elsewhere. The idea that a woman might sit freely among unrelated men was considered improper, even dangerous. Her isolation was framed as dignity, but it functioned as confinement. Daily routines reinforced obedience. Women rose early, worked constantly, and rested rarely. Cooking, spinning, weaving, cleaning, childcare, these tasks filled every hour. Leisure was considered suspicious. Idleness, people believed, led to disobedience or immoral thoughts. A busy woman was a controllable woman. Exhaustion itself became a tool of discipline. Marriage did not offer emotional partnership as we understand it today. In many ancient societies, marriage was an economic and social contract. Affection was secondary. Obedience was central. A husband's authority inside the home was rarely questioned. In Rome, while laws gradually limited extreme abuses, social norms still favored male dominance. A husband could discipline his wife, restrict her interactions, and control her daily life with little interference. In other cultures, domestic authority was even more absolute. In parts of ancient Mesopotamia, a husband could legally punish his wife for disobedience. The home became a private court where the man was judge, jury, and enforcer. What happened behind closed doors stayed there. Silence protected the system. Women were also isolated from other women. While modern imagination often pictures shared female spaces, many ancient households kept women separated, limiting their ability to form supportive networks.
Isolation weakened resistance. A woman alone was easier to control than a group that could share stories, compare treatment, and recognize injustice. Motherhood, while celebrated, added another layer of confinement. Pregnancy and childbirth tied women even more tightly to the home. In many ancient societies, childbirth was dangerous and poorly understood. Women gave birth repeatedly, often with little medical support. Survival itself became an act of endurance. Yet, despite the risks, women were expected to produce heirs, especially sons. Failure to do so could lead to neglect, humiliation, or replacement by another wife or concubine. Even joy inside the home was regulated. Laughter too loud, opinions too strong, emotions too visible, all could be criticized. Women learned to soften their voices, control their expressions, and anticipate male expectations. Emotional self-policing became second nature. Over time, many internalized the belief that this was simply the way the world worked. Religious practices reinforced domestic confinement. In many traditions, women were barred from certain rituals or sacred spaces, told that spiritual authority belonged to men. The home became their approved religious space as well, where prayer was private and unseen. Spiritual silence mirrored social silence. Widowhood did not always bring freedom. In some cultures, widows were expected to remain inside the household, living quietly under the authority of male relatives. In others, they faced suspicion, blame, or economic hardship. A woman without a husband was often viewed as incomplete or dangerous. Independence was not celebrated, it was feared. Yet within these walls, women also developed quiet forms of power. They managed resources, preserved traditions, raised the next generation, and passed down knowledge in whispers. Mothers taught daughters not only obedience, but survival, how to read moods, how to avoid conflict, how to endure. The domestic space was a paradox. It confined women, yet it also became the place where female culture survived. Stories, remedies, songs, and secret teachings lived here. While men ruled publicly, women shaped private life, influencing children long before society claimed them. Still, the cost was immense. Dreams were folded away like unused garments. Talents went unseen. Curiosity was dulled by routine. For many women, life passed entirely within a few rooms, measured not by years, but by chores and pregnancies. The ancient household was not merely a building, it was a system, one that trained women to accept limitation as love, confinement as care, silence as virtue. And because it was framed as protection, it endured for generations. But even the strongest walls develop cracks. Knowledge has always been dangerous to systems built on control, and in the ancient world, few things were considered more dangerous than an educated woman. What could not be confined by walls had to be restrained by ignorance, so learning itself became forbidden territory. Across civilizations, women were taught just enough to function, but never enough to question. Reading sacred texts, studying philosophy, learning law or medicine, these were privileges reserved for men. The belief was simple and deeply rooted. A woman who knew too much would no longer obey quietly. In ancient Greece, formal education belonged almost entirely to boys. They learned rhetoric, mathematics, philosophy, and politics. Girls, when taught at all, learned household skills. A woman capable of debate was seen as unnatural. Intellectual ambition in a woman was often mocked, feared, or moralized as arrogance. Rome allowed slightly more flexibility, but limits remained firm. Elite Roman women sometimes learned to read and write, but public intellectual life was closed to them. A woman who displayed too much intelligence risked being labeled manipulative or unfeminine. Praise was reserved for modesty, not brilliance. In ancient religious traditions, the boundaries were even stricter. Sacred knowledge was power, and power could not be shared freely. Women were often forbidden from interpreting religious law or participating in theological debate. Their role was to obey doctrine, not shape it. Spiritual authority became another locked door. Yet curiosity does not disappear simply because it is forbidden. Women learned in secret. Mothers taught daughters quietly, away from male oversight. Midwives passed down medical knowledge through practice rather than texts. Herbal remedies, birth techniques, and healing rituals survived outside formal institutions. This informal education was dismissed by men as superstition, yet it sustained communities for centuries. In some cultures, women disguised learning as obedience. They listened silently, remembered everything, and applied knowledge subtly. Intelligence learned to hide. Wisdom learned to whisper. But secrecy came with risk. A woman suspected of unusual knowledge could face suspicion or punishment. In later periods, this fear would erupt into witch hunts. But even in ancient times, women who healed or advised were often viewed with unease. Knowledge outside male control was unsettling. Writing was especially powerful. To write was to leave a trace, a voice that could survive. That is why so few ancient texts are written by women. It was not because women had nothing to say. It was because they were rarely allowed to record it. When women did write, their work was often attributed to men, lost or deliberately ignored. History preserved male voices because male voices were allowed to exist publicly. Women's thoughts lived and died in private spaces. Education was also controlled through fear of moral collapse. Many societies believed that educated women would become sexually immoral or rebellious. Knowledge and desire were linked in the male imagination. To protect social order, women's minds were restrained along with their bodies. This fear shaped marriage as well. A woman who knew too much might question her husband. She might challenge authority. She might refuse. So ignorance became a marital virtue. Yet some women broke through anyway. In rare cases, elite status provided a narrow opening. Daughters of philosophers, priests, or rulers sometimes gained access to education. These women often had to be exceptional just to be tolerated. And even then, their achievements were framed as anomalies, not examples to follow. Consider how often history describes intelligent women as dangerous, seductive, or unnatural. Their minds were treated as threats rather than gifts. Brilliance in women had to be explained away, controlled, or punished. Still, ideas are difficult to imprison. Women listened. Women remembered. Women passed things on. Stories, myths, and songs became vessels of knowledge. What could not be taught openly was preserved culturally. Wisdom survived in rhythm and memory when it could not survive on paper. And through all this, a quiet realization grew, that the limits placed on women were not natural laws, they were human choices. This understanding did not always lead to open rebellion. Often it led to patience, strategy, endurance. Women learned when to bend and when to wait. Resistance did not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like survival. As centuries passed, these small acts accumulated. Each whispered lesson, each hidden skill, each unrecorded thought became part of an invisible lineage, a history beneath history. And while ancient systems worked hard to silence women's minds, they never fully succeeded, because curiosity is persistent, because thought is resilient, because once a question is formed, it cannot be unformed. The ancient world feared educated women for a reason. They understood that control begins to fail the moment someone realizes it does not have to exist.
Fear has a way of changing shape. When rules no longer fully work, fear looks for new names. In the ancient world, that name was often the woman herself. Slowly, quietly, women stopped being seen merely as people who needed control and began to be framed as problems that needed explanation. Many societies started to believe that women were naturally closer to chaos. Their emotions were described as unstable, their bodies unpredictable, their influence dangerous. Menstruation, childbirth, desire, things not fully understood, became sources of anxiety. Instead of admitting ignorance, cultures blamed women. Stories began to circulate. Myths, legends, warnings passed from generation to generation. Women were portrayed as temptresses who led men astray, as vessels of weakness, as gates through which disaster entered the world. These stories did more than entertain, they justified control. If women were dangerous by nature, then restriction was protection. If women caused disorder, then punishment was prevention. In ancient Greek mythology, Pandora was blamed for releasing suffering into the world. In other traditions, women were associated with temptation, deception, and moral collapse. These narratives taught people to fear female autonomy long before they ever encountered it. Once fear took root, surveillance intensified. Women's behavior was watched closely. Their friendships, movements, even facial expressions were interpreted. A woman who laughed too freely, spoke too confidently, or lived too independently could be labeled suspicious, and suspicion alone was enough to ruin a life. Healers, midwives, and wise women occupied a dangerous space. They were necessary, yet feared. Communities relied on their knowledge, but distrusted its source. Healing that came from male institutions was called medicine. Healing that came from women was often dismissed as superstition or magic. Magic itself became a powerful accusation. In many ancient cultures, unexplained illness, infertility, or misfortune needed someone to blame. Women who lived alone, women without male protection, women who challenged norms became easy targets. Labeling them dangerous restored a sense of control to frightened societies. A woman who did not marry was suspicious. A woman who spoke back was suspicious. A woman who knew too much was suspicious. Fear did not always lead to execution. Often it led to isolation. Neighbors stopped visiting, markets closed their doors, trust disappeared. Social exile could be as deadly as physical punishment, especially in tightly bound communities. Over time, these fears hardened into beliefs. Beliefs became traditions, traditions became laws, and laws gave fear authority. Women internalized this fear as well. Many learned to shrink themselves deliberately, to hide intelligence, to suppress emotion, to avoid attention at all costs. Safety lay in blending in never becoming memorable. But fear also produced something else. Anger. Quiet, controlled, deeply buried anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that waits. Women began to recognize patterns, that punishment did not always follow wrongdoing, that obedience did not always bring safety, that even the most careful women could be blamed if society needed someone to blame.
This realization was dangerous, but it was also awakening. Some women began to resist roles assigned to them as monsters or temptresses by refusing to perform them. They chose restraint, wisdom, restraint again. Others embraced the labels placed upon them, using fear as a shield. If society already feared them, they might as well survive on their own terms. History rarely tells us how many women lived on the edges of society, navigating these labels carefully. Women who were neither saints nor villains, just human beings trying to exist without becoming targets. As generations passed, fear of women became self-perpetuating. Boys were raised hearing warnings, girls were raised hearing blame. Neither questioned where these stories came from. And yet, despite centuries of myth and fear, societies never fully eliminated women's influence. Women remained central to family, culture, and survival. They carried knowledge, memory, and continuity. Even those labeled dangerous continued to nurture life. This contradiction created tension. How could something so feared be so necessary? Rather than resolving it, ancient societies doubled down. More rules, more moral codes, more restrictions. The tighter the grip, the more fear leaked through the cracks. Because fear is not strength. It is insecurity wearing authority. The ancient world feared women not because women were weak, but because they were powerful in ways that could not be easily controlled. They shaped minds before laws ever touched them. They influenced values before politics existed. They carried culture forward quietly. That is why stories were written to diminish them. That is why myths blamed them. That is why rules surrounded them. And still, women endured. Not loudly, not always visibly, but persistently. When half of a society is restrained, the damage does not remain contained. It spreads quietly, shaping generations, altering values, and distorting what people come to believe is normal. Ancient civilizations rarely questioned this cost. They focused on order, stability, and tradition, never stopping to ask what was being lost in the process. Women's potential was one of the greatest losses. When curiosity is suppressed, innovation slows. When voices are silenced, perspective narrows. Ancient societies celebrated great thinkers, inventors, and leaders, yet systematically excluded women from becoming any of those things. The result was a world built on partial wisdom, guided by only half of human experience. This imbalance affected men as well. Boys grew up learning dominance instead of partnership. Emotional expression was discouraged, vulnerability punished. Men were taught to rule rather than understand. Relationships became hierarchical rather than mutual. Love, when it existed, had to survive within systems designed for control, not connection. Families absorbed these dynamics first. Children learned roles before they learned values. Sons watched their fathers command. Daughters watched their mothers endure. These lessons repeated themselves without needing explanation. Tradition did the teaching. Over time, restriction hardened into identity. Women were not just controlled, they were defined by their limitations. Weakness was assumed, dependence was expected, strength was framed as deviation. When a woman exceeded expectations, she was treated as an exception, never as evidence that the rules were wrong. Ancient laws often claimed to protect women, but protection came at the cost of autonomy. Safety was exchanged for silence. Care was offered in place of choice. And because danger was real in the ancient world, many women accepted these bargains, knowing the alternative could be worse. Yet acceptance did not mean contentment. Grief lived quietly beneath routine, the grief of unrealized abilities, of lives narrowed too early, of questions never asked out loud. This grief did not always have words, but it shaped behavior, relationships, and memory. Some women coped by finding meaning within the limits. They invested deeply in family, ritual, and tradition. They became the emotional anchors of households, the keepers of continuity. In doing so, they preserved cultures even as they were restricted by them. Others coped through detachment. Emotional distance became a shield. If expectations were impossible to change, then caring less was a form of survival. This quiet withdrawal rarely appears in historical records, but it existed in countless lives. The long-term effect of these systems was normalization. When restrictions last long enough, they stop feeling imposed and start feeling natural. Questioning them becomes unthinkable. Even those harmed by the system may defend it because it is the only world they know. This is how ancient restrictions endured for centuries, not through constant violence, but through repetition, through habit, through the slow erosion of imagination. Still, time has a way of revealing what once felt invisible. As civilizations fell, new ones rose on their foundations. Laws changed, religions evolved, empires collapsed. Yet many of the same ideas about women quietly survived, reshaped but recognizable. Control became custom, restriction became tradition, silence became virtue. The ancient world did not disappear, it echoed. Those echoes traveled through medieval societies, early modern laws, and even into contemporary thinking. The belief that women must be managed, that their bodies are public concerns, that their voices need moderation. These ideas did not emerge suddenly, they were inherited. Understanding ancient restrictions is not about condemning the past, it is about recognizing patterns, because patterns repeat when they are not examined. History often praises civilizations for their architecture, philosophy, and governance. Rarely does it measure what those civilizations cost the people they constrained. Greatness built on silence is still silence. Women under ancient restrictions were not passive victims. They were thinkers without classrooms, leaders without titles, creators without credit. Their lives were shaped by rules they did not write, but they shaped humanity anyway, through care, memory, resilience, and quiet strength. If history were rewritten with their voices included, it would sound very different, less certain, more complex, more human. And perhaps that is why those voices were excluded, because complexity threatens control, and humanity resists confinement. The ancient world believed order required restriction. What it never fully understood was that true strength comes from balance, not domination, from inclusion, not exclusion, from listening, not silencing. The women who lived under these rules did not live in vain. Their endurance carried humanity forward through centuries of limitation. Their unrecorded wisdom shaped generations. Their resistance, however small, planted questions that would one day grow louder. Those questions are still being asked, and they began long ago, inside homes, behind walls, in whispered conversations that history almost erased, but never completely. Time does something powerful to unjust systems. It exposes their fragility. The ancient restrictions placed on women were designed to feel permanent, unchangeable, even divinely ordained, yet history itself proves otherwise. Empires that claimed eternal authority collapsed. Laws carved in stone were buried. Traditions once defended with violence faded into memory. And through all of it, women adapted, survived, and quietly carried the seeds of change. As generations passed, cracks appeared where control once seemed absolute. Daughters asked questions their mothers had been afraid to ask. Small shifts in daily life accumulated. A woman managing household finances learned strategy. A mother teaching her child learned influence. A healer practicing quietly learned confidence. Power did not vanish just because it was unacknowledged. It changed form. In many ancient societies, women became the primary transmitters of culture. While men fought wars and ruled publicly, women shaped values at home. They taught language, morality, and belief long before children encountered laws or leaders. This influence was underestimated, and that underestimation allowed it to persist. Even within strict systems, women learned to negotiate. Obedience was sometimes strategic rather than sincere. Compliance could hide intention. Silence could conceal observation. Survival required intelligence, not passivity. Many women became experts at reading situations, anticipating danger, and navigating power without direct confrontation. These skills were not written down, they were lived. Over centuries, these lived experiences slowly altered social reality. What began as subtle shifts became noticeable differences. Some traditions softened, some laws changed, some roles expanded. Not because systems suddenly became just, but because reality resisted containment. Men, too, began to feel the limitations of rigid roles. Expectations of dominance isolated them emotionally. The pressure to control created distance. Relationships built on authority rather than trust proved fragile. Gradually, even those benefiting from the system sensed its cost. Change, however, was uneven and slow. Progress did not move forward in a straight line. Gains were often followed by backlash. Periods of relative freedom were met with renewed restriction. History moved in cycles, not conclusions. What endured was memory. Women remembered. Not always consciously, not always explicitly, but through instinct, storytelling, and behavior. Memory shaped how they raised daughters, how they warned them, how they prepared them for the world as it was, not as it should be. These memories crossed generations. Even when the original rules disappeared, their echoes lingered. Fear without a clear source, expectations without explanation, limits accepted without question. The past lived on inside the present. Understanding this is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that injustice is always obvious or intentional. Often it survives because it becomes familiar, because people mistake endurance for virtue and tradition for truth. The ancient restrictions on women did not require constant enforcement once they were internalized. They lived in habits, language, assumptions. They became invisible. Yet invisibility does not mean inevitability. Every era contains moments where inherited beliefs are questioned, where someone notices the gap between what is accepted and what is fair. Those moments are rarely dramatic at first. They begin quietly, with discomfort, curiosity, or doubt. The ancient women who lived under strict control may not have imagined the future, but their endurance made it possible. Every time a woman survived, adapted, or protected knowledge, she extended humanity's options. She kept possibility alive. History often celebrates revolution, but transformation usually begins much earlier, in unseen ways. It begins with awareness, with the realization that rules are made by people, not nature, that what exists can change. The ancient world believed women needed restriction to maintain order. What it failed to understand was that order enforced through imbalance creates instability. Suppressed voices do not disappear, they accumulate pressure. Eventually, something gives. That moment does not belong to one generation. It is built across many, across lives lived quietly under rules that were never just, across choices made not to surrender completely. The story of women under ancient restrictions is not only a story of suffering, it is a story of continuity, of resilience so ordinary it went unnoticed, of strength that did not announce itself. And that may be its most powerful lesson, because history is not only shaped by those who speak the loudest, it is shaped by those who persist the longest. The ancient world tried to define women by limitation, but limitation never erased humanity. It only revealed how adaptable it could be. The echoes of those ancient rules still exist, but so do the echoes of resistance. They exist in questions asked, boundaries challenged, and voices reclaimed. They exist because history did not end in silence. It continued. And it continues still. Even in the darkest systems, small acts of resistance accumulate into something larger. In the ancient world, women's quiet defiance often went unnoticed by history, but it was profound. A woman teaching her daughter a skill that men deemed unnecessary. A mother telling stories that included wisdom not recorded in official texts. A healer quietly curing illness without approval. Each small act challenged the assumption that women should remain confined and ignorant. In some cultures, women formed subtle networks to preserve knowledge and influence outcomes. These networks were rarely formal. They were whispers, shared secrets, guidance passed from one generation to the next. Through them, traditions survived, even when laws and customs tried to erase them. Knowledge became a hidden currency. Survival, a kind of intelligence. In ancient Rome, elite women sometimes leveraged their social connections to influence politics indirectly. They advised husbands, guided sons, and managed estates. Their power was often invisible, but real, exercised through negotiation, persuasion, and strategic alliances. While men held public authority, women shaped private spheres that had ripple effects far beyond the home. Control over households translated into subtle cultural influence. In ancient Egypt, women occasionally became pharaohs, ruling in their own right. Figures like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra defied the norm entirely, demonstrating that the structures designed to limit women could be bypassed, though at great personal risk. Their reigns showed that authority was not inherently male, it was a social construct that could be challenged. Resistance was not always grand or heroic. It could be mundane, yet impactful. A woman deciding how to educate her children, choosing how to pass on traditions, maintaining cultural memory, or simply surviving and teaching survival strategies. Over generations, these choices shaped communities, influenced societies, and preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Some women found creative ways to work within the system while subtly expanding their freedom. They became storytellers, healers, midwives, teachers, or artisans. Their contributions often went unrecorded by official history, yet they were crucial to the survival and stability of their communities. The ability to wield influence quietly required ingenuity, resilience, and courage. Even under extreme restrictions, women discovered ways to assert agency. The ancient legal and social codes were designed to suppress independence, Yet they could not suppress intelligence, resourcefulness, or moral strength. Women navigated a complex web of expectation, fear, and tradition, sometimes subverting rules by acting within loopholes, exploiting cultural norms, or simply outlasting those who sought to control them. The paradox of ancient restrictions is that the very constraints intended to weaken women often revealed their resilience and ingenuity. When agency was forbidden, women developed subtle strategies to survive and influence the world. When expression was restricted, they found ways to communicate wisdom quietly. When public power was denied, private power flourished. Over centuries, these small acts of defiance accumulated, creating an undercurrent of change. The restrictions placed on women shaped history, but women themselves also shaped history, often invisibly. Their lives were not entirely dictated by laws or social norms. Every choice, every survival strategy, every act of quiet rebellion was a statement that control could be challenged, even if subtly. By observing these patterns, we can see that history is more complex than the official records suggest. While laws, myths, and social codes sought to define and confine women, women continuously redefined themselves, their families, and their societies. Their legacy is not merely survival, it is adaptation, ingenuity, and continuity in the face of systemic limitation. This persistence laid the foundation for later social change. Centuries later, when legal and educational reforms began to expand women's rights, the groundwork was already present. Knowledge, experience, and wisdom, passed down through generations of constrained lives, became a reservoir that could be drawn upon when opportunities arose. What had been forced into secrecy became a hidden strength. In every restricted home, in every silent act of defiance, in every whispered story, women preserved not just themselves, but their communities. They demonstrated that human potential cannot be fully erased by restriction, and that resilience is often born, not in comfort, but in constraint. The ancient world tried to define women by what they could not do, but women repeatedly proved that influence, knowledge, and courage could flourish quietly, invisibly, and persistently. And so, as history continued, the story of women under ancient restrictions became not only a story of oppression, but a story of enduring human spirit. It reminds us that even when voices are suppressed, they leave traces. Even when lives are limited, they create impact. And even when power is denied, influence finds a way to survive. The ancient restrictions were formidable, but not absolute, and through all the laws, customs, and myths designed to contain them, women endured, resisted, adapted, and ultimately shaped the course of history itself. Their quiet strength remains one of the most remarkable, yet often overlooked, legacies of the ancient world. The persistence of women under restriction did more than just preserve life. It preserved ideas, culture, and memory. Even when denied formal education, excluded from politics, or confined within the household, women became the invisible backbone of civilizations. They passed down wisdom, ethics, and survival strategies, shaping society in ways that official histories rarely acknowledge. Each generation inherited not just rules and restrictions, but also subtle resistance, strategies, and unspoken knowledge. In many ancient civilizations, the home became a microcosm of the world outside. Within it, women exercised influence over family, finances, and ritual. While their authority was limited, it was also crucial. Decisions about food, medicine, child-rearing, and household alliances shaped the day-to-day survival of communities. This influence, though largely invisible to male-dominated histories, was powerful. societies depended on women's labor, intelligence, and moral guidance, even while limiting their public power. Some women leveraged their limited power in remarkable ways. In Egypt, women managed estates and temples, sometimes acting as patrons, advisors, and even informal rulers. In Rome, elite women could influence politics through social networks, marriage alliances, and careful negotiation. In Greece, although most women were confined, priestesses and influential mothers sometimes wielded authority in sacred or domestic spheres. Each act, each maneuver, quietly reshaped society while operating within or cleverly around the confines imposed by law and custom. Education, though restricted, was not entirely lost. Mothers and grandmothers became the custodians of practical knowledge. They taught daughters how to manage households, raise children, and navigate social expectations. Midwives transmitted medical and herbal knowledge, crucial to survival. Storytelling preserved history, morality, and cultural identity. In these private spheres, women maintained continuity and prepared future generations to survive within systems designed to limit them. The experience of restriction also fostered unique forms of intelligence. Women learned to read situations, anticipate danger, and negotiate outcomes carefully. Emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and resilience became essential skills. In many ways, survival required a sophistication often underestimated by historical observers. While men might wield overt political or military power, women mastered influence that was subtle, adaptive, and enduring. Yet restriction also exacted a cost. Women were denied full access to knowledge, opportunity, and recognition. Many brilliant minds were never realized. Creativity, ambition, and leadership were stifled. The social, cultural, and scientific potential of half the population was constrained, leaving societies with an incomplete record of human achievement. The structures of limitation shaped not only the lives of women, but the broader course of civilizations, shaping what was valued and what remained invisible. Despite these costs, resilience persisted. Women continued to adapt and influence society in myriad ways. Each act of endurance, each quiet decision contributed to survival and continuity. This hidden strength often goes unrecorded, yet it forms the foundation of social and cultural progress. By preserving knowledge, maintaining families, and nurturing communities, women under restriction ensured that society could endure and eventually evolve. Across centuries, the tension between restriction and resistance became a defining feature of women's experience. Laws and customs attempted to limit autonomy, but human ingenuity and resilience persisted. The contrast between control and influence highlights the complexity of ancient social structures. Power was never absolute, and resistance, even when invisible, never disappeared. This enduring legacy provides a vital lesson. History is shaped not only by those with formal authority, but by those whose survival and ingenuity quietly influence the world around them. Women under ancient restrictions demonstrate that strength does not always manifest in public or overt forms. Influence, knowledge, and resilience can thrive even under extreme limitation. As we look back on these societies, it becomes clear that restrictions imposed on women were not only morally unjust, they were strategically short-sighted. By limiting the potential of half the population, civilizations constrained their own growth. The persistence of women, however, shows that human potential cannot be fully suppressed. Knowledge, culture, and resilience find ways to endure, even in the harshest conditions. The story of women under ancient restrictions is therefore not simply one of oppression. It is also a story of endurance, adaptation, and influence that transcends visible power. It teaches us that even when overt control dominates, the human spirit persists, often in subtle, transformative ways. It is a story of survival and impact that echoes across time, reminding us that resilience often operates quietly, invisibly, and with lasting effect. In this light, the ancient world is both a cautionary tale and a testament to endurance. It warns of the costs of systemic restriction while revealing the extraordinary capacity of individuals to preserve knowledge, culture, and humanity. Women endured, adapted, and influenced history in ways that were often unseen, yet profoundly significant, and their legacy continues to shape the world even centuries after the laws and customs that sought to confine them have faded.
The endurance of women under ancient restrictions also reveals a crucial truth. Influence does not always require formal authority. While men commanded armies, passed laws, and ruled publicly, women shaped values, maintained social cohesion, and transmitted knowledge that allowed societies to function. They were the keepers of continuity, even when denied recognition. This influence, largely invisible to official records, was nevertheless essential. Without it, many civilizations would have lacked stability, moral guidance, and cultural memory. One remarkable aspect of this hidden power was women's ability to adapt. In situations where laws and customs left little room for autonomy, women became skilled negotiators of their circumstances. They balanced compliance with subtle resistance, obedience with ingenuity. A mother might adhere strictly to societal expectations outwardly, while secretly teaching her daughters critical thinking, survival strategies, or forbidden knowledge. These quiet acts created an undercurrent of resilience that official histories rarely acknowledge. The private sphere became a site of empowerment. Within homes, women managed finances, controlled food distribution, and mediated relationships. Their decisions determined the survival and comfort of families. In many cases, households run efficiently by women provided the social and economic foundation that enabled larger structures of power to exist. Authority in these intimate spaces, though informal, had tangible consequences for communities. Men may have held titles and legal control, but women's influence shaped daily life in profound and lasting ways. Even when public participation was denied, women found channels to extend their reach. Religious institutions, for example, sometimes offered opportunities for subtle influence. Priestesses, temple attendants, and midwives could wield moral authority or practical knowledge. Though constrained, these roles allowed women to navigate systems that sought to restrict them, offering guidance, mediation, and expertise. Knowledge of ritual, medicine, and domestic management became a kind of currency through which women exerted power without attracting overt scrutiny. Another form of influence emerged through storytelling and memory. Women preserved oral histories, cultural practices, and moral teachings. In societies where literacy or formal education was restricted, storytelling ensured that knowledge persisted. Lessons learned through experience, wisdom gained from endurance, and strategies for survival were passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation. These transmissions shaped behavior, informed decision-making, and sustained communities over centuries, demonstrating that influence can endure even without formal acknowledgement. The cumulative impact of these efforts is remarkable. Over generations, women's quiet resilience contributed to social stability, cultural continuity, and intellectual preservation. Although laws, customs, and myths sought to limit autonomy, they could not erase resourcefulness, moral guidance, or the transmission of knowledge. These invisible networks of influence laid the groundwork for future social transformations, creating a foundation that later generations could build upon when opportunities for formal power finally emerged. Yet the tension between restriction and resistance remained constant. Women navigated a delicate balance,
Compliance ensured survival, while subtle defiance preserved autonomy. Their strategies required extraordinary psychological skill, patience, and foresight. To thrive under such constraints, women developed emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and a keen sense of observation, skills often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on overt authority. This duality, being simultaneously constrained and influential, highlights the complexity of women's experience in the ancient world. While laws and social norms sought to define them narrowly, women constantly negotiated, challenged, and expanded the boundaries of what was possible. Their influence was subtle but pervasive, a force shaping families, communities, and cultures over time. Importantly, this pattern of adaptation demonstrates that control, no matter how strict, is never absolute. Systems that rely on fear, restriction, or invisibility cannot fully suppress human ingenuity or agency. Women's capacity to survive, adapt, and influence, even under extreme limitations, underscores the resilience of the human spirit. As we examine these patterns, it becomes clear that ancient restrictions did not just affect women, they affected entire societies. By limiting the potential of half the population, civilizations constrained creativity, knowledge, and social progress. Yet the persistence of women's influence ensured that progress, though slowed, was never halted. Small acts of survival, adaptation, and quiet leadership created cumulative effects that extended far beyond individual lives, shaping the trajectory of history itself. The story of women under ancient restrictions is therefore both a cautionary tale and an inspiring legacy. It warns of the costs of systemic oppression, while revealing the extraordinary capacity for resilience and ingenuity. Despite centuries of control, women endured, adapted, and shaped the world in ways that continue to resonate. Their lives remind us that influence and power are not always visible, and that endurance can be as transformative as authority. In reflecting on this history, we recognize that the lessons extend beyond ancient societies. They illuminate the importance of preserving agency, valuing diverse voices, and understanding that systems of control are never absolute. Human creativity, wisdom, and resilience persist even under the most restrictive conditions. Women's endurance under ancient restrictions exemplifies this truth, providing both a historical record and a timeless lesson about the power of quiet persistence, invisible influence, and the enduring capacity of the human spirit.
Even as societies evolved, the echoes of ancient restrictions lingered. Centuries passed, empires fell, and new civilizations arose. But many of the patterns that confined women remained, subtly woven into laws, customs, and social expectations. Daughters were still warned about propriety, wives were still expected to obey, and knowledge was still often rationed. The mechanisms had changed, but the underlying assumptions persisted. Women were fragile, dangerous, or incomplete without male guidance. Education slowly became more accessible in some regions, yet even then, the lingering fear of women's influence shaped what was taught. Curricula were designed to prepare them for domestic life first, intellectual pursuits second. Even when women gained literacy, property rights, or limited political roles, society often framed their achievements as exceptions rather than proof of broader potential. Recognition came sparingly, and often only when it could be tolerated within existing hierarchies. Despite these limitations, women continued to innovate within the spaces available to them. They became patrons of the arts, skilled artisans, influential mothers, and educators.
In some cases, they wielded informal political influence, guiding decisions behind the scenes, or shaping the next generation of leaders. These forms of power, while less visible than armies or legislatures, had lasting impact. Decisions made quietly in households or through social networks influenced broader communities and sometimes entire cities. The persistence of women's influence demonstrates that control is never absolute. Even in societies with rigid laws, fear, and social norms, individuals find ways to navigate and reshape their environment. Women adapted, negotiated, and subtly subverted restrictions, ensuring that knowledge, culture, and moral guidance persisted. Survival required creativity, foresight, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Interestingly, the cumulative effect of these quiet acts of resilience often outlasted the structures designed to suppress them. Where laws failed to protect or empower women, cultural memory preserved their contributions. Oral histories, rituals, domestic management strategies, and moral teachings carried forward lessons that official records neglected. Women became the invisible custodians of civilization, maintaining continuity through periods of upheaval, conquest, and cultural change. These historical patterns carry a profound lesson for understanding power. Authority may control visible behavior, but influence often operates beneath the surface. Restriction does not erase intelligence, creativity, or moral agency. It transforms it. Women, under ancient and evolving restrictions, developed sophisticated strategies to survive and shape society, leaving legacies that would only be recognized much later. By studying these patterns, we also see the human cost of limitation. Societies that restricted half their population squandered potential. Many ideas, innovations, and talents were never fully realized. Human progress in science, art, and philosophy was constrained by gendered assumptions. Yet paradoxically, the resilience of women ensured that even under severe limitations, culture, knowledge, and moral guidance endured. The story of women under ancient restrictions is thus both cautionary and inspiring. It warns of the costs of oppression while highlighting the extraordinary persistence of human ingenuity. It demonstrates that influence is not always formal, that power is not always visible, and that survival under constraint can foster profound resilience and creativity. Even today, echoes of these ancient restrictions remain, reminding us that the struggle for equality is ongoing. Understanding history allows us to recognize patterns, question inherited assumptions, and appreciate the invisible contributions of those whose lives were shaped by restriction. Women's endurance under ancient rules is a testament to the enduring strength of human spirit, capable of shaping the course of civilization even in the face of systemic limitation. And as we move forward, acknowledging this hidden history helps us see that influence, resilience, and wisdom are not confined by power, position, or permission. They are cultivated wherever individuals persist, adapt, and endure.
The endurance of women under restriction also reshaped culture in profound, often invisible ways. While laws and traditions sought to confine them, women maintained continuity through rituals, stories, and practices that survived across generations. Festivals, domestic ceremonies, and household observances often carried dual purposes, honoring tradition and transmitting knowledge. Women became the keepers of memory, embedding practical lessons and moral guidance into practices that seemed ordinary but were rich with meaning. In homes across ancient civilizations, women taught daughters how to survive, how to navigate complex social hierarchies, and how to cultivate resilience.
Lessons included practical skills like managing resources, cooking, and medicine, but also subtler education, how to read character, anticipate danger, and negotiate power quietly. These teachings, though informal, were critical for survival. They constituted a form of education that operated outside official channels, proving that restriction could never fully silence human ingenuity. This influence extended beyond households. Women shaped communities through social networks, marriages, and mentorship. Even without public authority, they guided decisions that affected trade, alliances, and local governance indirectly. Through ritual, advice, and example, they reinforced social cohesion, preserved cultural memory, and ensured that values survived times of upheaval. Their power was invisible, yet indispensable. Historical records, largely written by men, often failed to capture this subtle influence. When women appear in texts, it is frequently as exceptions or in contexts framed by male authority. But archaeological evidence, folklore, and oral traditions reveal a parallel narrative. Women were active agents shaping the world around them. They adapted to constraints, maneuvered within restrictions, and preserved knowledge for the future. The psychological impact of these restrictions was complex. Women internalized societal expectations, learning to self-regulate in ways that ensured survival. Silence, obedience, and invisibility became strategies, not merely imposed behaviors. Yet internalization did not mean passivity. Many women combined outward compliance with private resistance, nurturing potential within the safety of domestic spaces and subtly influencing their environment. Resilience under restriction also cultivated creativity. When formal avenues for learning, leadership, or expression were blocked, women found alternative ways to develop skill, transmit knowledge, and shape culture. Storytelling, embroidery, ritual performance, and caregiving became vehicles for influence and education. Each of these practices preserved wisdom and nurtured the next generation, creating a hidden but enduring legacy of ingenuity. Over centuries, these patterns reinforced themselves. Each generation inherited the strategies, knowledge, and resilience of the previous one. What started as individual survival became collective endurance. Communities adapted around women's hidden contributions, often depending on them for cohesion and continuity, even as laws and customs sought to marginalize them. This legacy demonstrates a crucial principle. Control is never absolute. Systems can impose boundaries and penalties, but human ingenuity, resilience, and the desire for autonomy persist. Women under ancient restrictions may have faced severe limitations, but they continually found ways to shape society, preserve knowledge, and influence outcomes. Their impact, though rarely recognized in official histories, was profound. Understanding this history challenges conventional narratives about power and influence. It reminds us that authority is not only exercised in courts or armies, it also operates through survival, strategy, and cultural continuity. Women under restriction exemplify how invisible influence can sustain civilizations and shape the future even when formal recognition is denied. The ancient restrictions, as oppressive as they were, also illuminate human adaptability. They show that endurance, creativity, and subtle resistance can transform constraint into a hidden form of agency. The lessons of these women are not just historical, they resonate across time, demonstrating that resilience and influence do not always require permission or visibility. And so, the story of women under ancient restrictions continues to unfold, echoing through history, reminding us that even in the harshest systems, human intelligence and spirit find ways to survive, adapt, and endure.
Even within the strictest confines, women found ways to assert presence and identity. Clothing,
Hairstyle, jewelry, and domestic decor became subtle forms of self-expression. While public behavior was closely monitored, private spaces allowed experimentation and personal style. These choices, though seemingly minor, communicated status, taste, and individuality. They were acts of agency, small but significant defiance within highly controlled societies. In some ancient cultures, women leveraged rituals and festivals to assert visibility. Seasonal ceremonies, religious processions, and household rites often provided sanctioned occasions where women could exercise influence more openly. Participation allowed them to transmit values, demonstrate competence, and reinforce social bonds. Though these spaces were circumscribed by tradition, women used them creatively to shape perception and maintain a degree of autonomy. Marriage, the cornerstone of social expectation, also became a site of subtle negotiation. While contracts, dowries, and alliances constrained choice, women still exercised agency within these frameworks. They could manage household operations, influence decision-making, and maintain networks that extended beyond their immediate family. Some used charm, intelligence, and strategic alliances to safeguard their children's future or improve social standing. These maneuvers demonstrate that influence often operates behind the surface in ways that formal records overlook. Pregnancy and motherhood were central to women's roles, yet even these biological realities offered avenues for power. Mothers shaped the next generation's values, behaviors, and survival strategies. They educated children, instilled moral frameworks, and transmitted cultural memory. In doing so, they exerted influence over the long-term direction of families, communities, and sometimes even states. The authority of motherhood, though informal, had enduring consequences. Women's influence was also evident in economic management. In households across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Rome, women supervised food storage, textile production, and domestic labor. Wealth and resource allocation often depended on their judgment. A well-managed household ensured not only survival, but also social respectability. Economic competence became a quiet form of power, one that men could not fully control or replace. Despite these avenues for subtle influence, the psychological burden of restriction remained. Women internalized societal expectations, balancing compliance with personal ambition. Many cultivated patience, observation, and emotional intelligence to navigate daily life safely. Self-control was not merely discipline, it was a survival strategy. Women learned when to assert themselves and when to remain invisible, and these skills required sophistication often unacknowledged by historical accounts. Education, when permitted, was selectively granted and carefully controlled. Girls learned literacy and numeracy only to the extent that it supported domestic responsibilities or social propriety. Higher knowledge, philosophy, science, theology, was typically off-limits, yet informal learning persisted. Mothers and mentors taught practical skills, herbal medicine, and oral traditions, ensuring that knowledge survived despite formal exclusion. Secrecy became a tool of preservation. Networks of support among women were another form of resilience. Friendships, alliances, and mentorships provided guidance, emotional support, and protection. In some cases, these networks enabled women to navigate restrictions collectively, share resources, and preserve cultural knowledge. Though not always documented, such networks were crucial to survival and influence, demonstrating how communities adapt to limitations imposed from above. Through these strategies, women transformed constraint into opportunity. By mastering domestic spaces, cultivating relationships, and preserving knowledge, they maintained influence in ways that were often invisible but profoundly consequential. Their lives reveal a pattern repeated across time. Control may limit expression, but it cannot erase ingenuity, wisdom, or the capacity to shape society. Even as civilizations codified restrictions, women's resilience ensured that the structures they inhabited were not static. Adaptation, negotiation, and subtle resistance allowed influence to persist. The very systems designed to suppress them became channels for enduring cultural, social, and moral impact. The story of women under ancient restrictions, therefore, is not only one of oppression, but also of extraordinary endurance, strategy, and hidden power. It demonstrates that influence and resilience can flourish even under extreme limitation, shaping societies and leaving legacies that echo long after the laws and customs that sought to constrain them have faded.